September 1942. Somewhere along the foggy coastline of Maine, 17-year-old Margaret Sullivan stepped off the bus, carrying nothing but a canvas bag filled with drawing supplies and her mother's sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The autumn air tasted of salt and pine, and she breathed it in deeply, grateful to escape the suffocating heat of her Boston boarding school. She had no idea that her simple weekend sketching trip would unravel one of the most sophisticated espionage networks operating on American soil. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as an innocent artistic endeavor would transform this quiet teenager into an unlikely hero whose keen observation would expose a web of deception that had evaded federal authorities for over 18 months. Margaret had always been drawn to lighthouses. There was something about their solitary strength, standing against the endless assault of waves, that resonated with her own sense of being different. At school, while other girls gossiped about soldiers and swing music, she spent her free hours sketching architectural details and reading about maritime history. Her art teacher, Miss Carolyn Bradford, had encouraged this passion, telling her that true artists saw what others overlooked. Margaret never imagined how literally true those words would become. The Pembroke Point Lighthouse sat on a rocky outcrop 3 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. Margaret had written to the lighthouse keeper weeks earlier, a Mr. Thomas Hendricks, requesting permission to sketch the structure for her portfolio. His response had been brief but welcoming, written in neat, precise handwriting that suggested a meticulous personality. He had included detailed directions and mentioned that visitors were rare, especially with the war making people suspicious of anyone lingering near the coast. As Margaret walked the final mile to the lighthouse, she noticed details that her artist's eye automatically catalogued. The road showed recent tire tracks, unusual for such an isolated location. Broken branches suggested a vehicle had passed through within the last day or two. The forest itself seemed unnaturally quiet, with none of the bird calls she expected in late afternoon. These observations flickered through her mind without particular alarm, merely filed away as her feet crunched over fallen leaves. The lighthouse emerged from the tree line like a white sentinel, its paint gleaming despite the overcast sky. The keeper's cottage sat adjacent, a tidy structure with curtained windows and a vegetable garden showing signs of recent tending. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning applewood. Everything appeared perfectly normal, exactly as a coastal lighthouse station should look in wartime America. Thomas Hendricks answered her knock within seconds, as if he had been waiting just inside. He was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades facing ocean winds. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but reserved. He wore a lighthouse keeper's standard uniform, everything regulation and proper. "Welcome, Miss Sullivan," he said, his accent carrying the flat vowels of the Maine coast. "You picked a fair day for sketching. Weather's supposed to hold until evening. Come inside and warm yourself. I've got coffee on the stove." The cottage interior was immaculate. Nautical charts covered one wall, maritime books filled a shelf near the fireplace, and everything from the braided rug to the oil lamps suggested a man devoted to his solitary profession. Margaret accepted the offered coffee, noting that it was stronger and more bitter than what her mother served at home. Hendricks explained the lighthouse schedule, the timing of the light's rotation, the maintenance routines that filled his days. "I'll be conducting my rounds this afternoon," he told her. "You're welcome to sketch from any angle you like, but please stay clear of the light room itself. Equipment's sensitive, and with the war on, regulations are strict about who can access the operational areas." Margaret assured him she understood, and set up her station on the rocky point 50 yards from the lighthouse base. She arranged her supplies, selected a piece of charcoal, and began the preliminary sketch that would guide her watercolor work. The lighthouse rose before her, and she lost herself in the familiar rhythm of observation and translation, her hand moving across the paper in confident strokes. 2 hours passed. The light shifted as clouds moved overhead, creating dramatic shadows that enhanced the lighthouse's austere beauty. Margaret worked steadily, filling 3 pages with different perspectives. It was during her 4th sketch, when she moved to capture the cottage from a side angle that she noticed something odd. From her new position, she could see a window on the cottage's north side, one that faced away from the main approach road. Through this window, visible only because of the angle of the fading sunlight, she glimpsed something that made her pause mid-stroke. Inside what she assumed was a storage room or pantry, she saw equipment that seemed entirely out of place in a lighthouse keeper's cottage. The object resembled a radio, but far more complex than any civilian model she had seen. Her father worked for a defense contractor in Boston, and she had visited his office enough times to recognize certain types of equipment. What she was seeing looked military-grade, with multiple dials and what appeared to be a telegraph key. Beside it sat stacks of what looked like papers or documents, far too many for simple lighthouse logs. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She forced herself to continue sketching, but her mind raced. Perhaps it was legitimate. Perhaps lighthouse keepers needed sophisticated radio equipment for communication with maritime authorities. But then why position it in a back room, away from the main living areas? And why had Hendricks not mentioned it during his tour of the cottage? She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Hendricks approaching, carrying a tray with a sandwich and a glass of milk. "I thought you might be hungry," he said pleasantly. "You've been working for quite some time." "Thank you," Margaret replied, accepting the tray with what she hoped was a natural smile. "This is very kind of you. The lighthouse is even more beautiful than I imagined." They talked for a few minutes about her art, about his years of lighthouse keeping, about the war, and how it had changed life along the coast. Hendricks seemed entirely ordinary, a dedicated civil servant performing an essential wartime duty. Yet Margaret could not shake the image of that radio equipment, could not ignore the small voice whispering that something was not quite right. As Hendricks returned to the cottage, Margaret made a decision. She would finish her sketching as planned, thank him politely, and mention what she had seen to the local authorities in town. Probably it was nothing. Probably she was being paranoid, influenced by all the war posters warning about enemy agents and saboteurs. But Miss Bradford had taught her to trust her observations, and her observations told her that something about this situation deserved a second look. The sun was setting when Margaret packed her supplies. She had produced 5 solid sketches and had enough reference material for several watercolor paintings. Hendricks walked her to the edge of the lighthouse property, maintaining his courteous demeanor. "Will you be returning?" he asked. "You're welcome any time, though I'd appreciate advance notice. Regulations, you understand." "I'm not sure," Margaret replied honestly. "It depends on my school schedule. But thank you for your hospitality." As she walked back along the dirt road, darkness gathering beneath the trees, Margaret noticed something she had missed on her arrival. About half a mile from the lighthouse, partially concealed by underbrush, sat a vehicle. It was a dark sedan, American-made, with mud-splattered fenders and what looked like a tarp covering something in the back seat. The vehicle was empty, but its presence this far from any dwelling seemed strange. Margaret quickened her pace, suddenly eager to reach the bus station and the safety of well-lit streets. The forest sounds that had seemed peaceful in daylight now felt menacing. Every crack of a twig made her jump. By the time she reached the main road, she was nearly running. The town of Pembroke consisted of one main street, a handful of shops, a church, and a police station that doubled as the town clerk's office. It was fully dark when Margaret pushed through the station door, breathless and probably looking wild-eyed. The officer on duty, a middle-aged man named Deputy Frank Morrison, looked up from his newspaper with mild alarm. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, rising from his desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret poured out her story in a rush. The lighthouse, the radio equipment, the hidden car, her growing sense that something was wrong. To his credit, Morrison listened without interrupting, though his expression suggested he thought she was an overwrought teenager, with an overactive imagination. "Mr. Hendricks has been our lighthouse keeper for 6 years, Morrison said patiently when she finished. "He's a respected member of our community. The Coast Guard inspects that lighthouse quarterly. If there was anything irregular, they would know about it." "But the radio," Margaret insisted. "It wasn't a normal radio." "It looked like the kind of equipment my father's company makes for the military. Lighthouse keepers need good communication equipment, miss, especially now with enemy submarines operating off our coast. What you saw was probably standard marine radio gear. Margaret felt her certainty wavering. Perhaps she had overreacted. Perhaps the war hysteria had gotten to her like it had to so many others, making them see threats where none existed. She thanked Morrison for his time and left the station, feeling foolish. But she could not forget what she had seen. That night, lying in the boarding house bed she had rented in town, Margaret stared at the ceiling and replayed every detail. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something was genuinely wrong. Miss Bradford's voice echoed in her memory. "Trust your observations, Margaret. Your eyes see truly, even when others doubt." The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking the bus back to Boston as planned, she walked to the town's postal office and sent a telegram to her father. The message was brief. "Need you to contact your military friends. Think I found something at Pembroke Point Lighthouse. Not imagining things. Please trust me. Love, Margaret." Her father, Robert Sullivan, was a structural engineer who had worked on several defense contracts since the war began. More importantly, he had contacts within the military intelligence community, men who took him seriously when he raised concerns. Margaret knew that if anyone could get proper authorities to investigate, it was him. 3 days later, Margaret was sitting in a borrowed office at the Coast Guard station in Portland, facing 2 men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves as Special Agents William Chen and Robert Foster from the Office of Naval Intelligence. They had serious faces and asked serious questions, taking notes as she described everything she had seen. "Can you draw what you observed through that window?" Chen asked, sliding a blank piece of paper across the table. Margaret sketched quickly, her art training serving her well. She drew the radio equipment from memory, capturing the distinctive configuration of dials and the antenna connection she had noticed. When she finished, she saw Chen and Foster exchange a meaningful glance. "Miss Sullivan," Foster said carefully, "what you've described matches a specific type of radio equipment. It's not civilian gear, and it's not standard Coast Guard issue. We need to ask you some very important questions, and we need you to be absolutely certain of your answers." For the next 2 hours, they questioned her about every detail. What time had she arrived? What had Hendricks said? What had she noticed about the cottage interior? Had she seen any papers or documents? Were there any other visitors? Margaret answered everything as precisely as she could, drawing additional sketches when words proved insufficient. Finally, Chen leaned back in his chair and looked at his partner. "We need to move on this," he said. "If she's right about what she saw, we can't wait." "What's going on?" Margaret asked. "Is Mr. Hendricks a spy?" "We can't share operational details," Foster replied, "but your observations have been extremely helpful. We're going to ask you to stay in Portland for a few more days, just in case we need additional information. Your father has been notified and has given permission." The next week was the longest of Margaret's life. She stayed in a Coast Guard facility, forbidden from contacting anyone or leaving the building. She read, sketched, and waited, her imagination running wild with possibilities. Had she really uncovered a spy ring? Or would this end with embarrassment and apologies to an innocent lighthouse keeper? On the 8th day, Chen and Foster returned. They looked exhausted but satisfied. They asked her to sit down, and then they told her a story that seemed impossible. Thomas Hendricks was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Thomas Heinrichs, a foreign national who had emigrated to America in 1933 and had systematically built a false identity. He had indeed worked as a lighthouse keeper, using the position's isolation and radio access to transmit coded messages to enemy submarines operating in the Atlantic. The equipment Margaret had glimpsed was a sophisticated shortwave radio capable of reaching across the ocean. But Hendricks was not working alone. The investigation his exposure triggered had uncovered a network of 8 other individuals, all engaged in espionage activities along the eastern seaboard. They operated under a system of coded communications and dead drops, passing information about ship movements, coastal defenses, and military installations. The dark sedan, Margaret had noticed, belonged to one of Hendricks's contacts, a man posing as a traveling salesman who collected intelligence and delivered coded instructions. "Your observation of that radio," Chen told her, "gave us the evidence we needed for search warrants. When we raided the lighthouse, We found not just the radio equipment, but coding materials, message logs, and maps marked with ship routes and patrol patterns. Hendricks kept meticulous records, which is helping us dismantle the entire network. What will happen to him? Margaret asked quietly. He and his associates will face trial, Foster replied. The evidence is overwhelming. What you did, Miss Sullivan, may have saved lives. Those submarine attacks we've been experiencing, some of them were possible because of information Hendricks was transmitting. By stopping him, you've made the Atlantic crossing safer for our convoys. Margaret felt overwhelmed. She was 17 years old. She had gone to sketch a lighthouse. How had her life become entangled in espionage and federal investigations? The subsequent trial was held in federal court under tight security. Margaret testified about her observations, answering questions from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Hendricks, seated at the defense table, never looked at her. His face remained expressionless as she described the radio equipment and her growing suspicions. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and when it concluded, Hendricks and 5 of his associates were convicted of espionage. The sentences were severe, reflecting the gravity of wartime treason. The case might have ended there, another footnote in the vast machinery of wartime security. But Margaret's role in exposing the spy ring caught the attention of military intelligence officials who recognized something valuable. This teenage girl, with no training in espionage or security work, had noticed details that trained personnel had missed. She had trusted her instincts despite being dismissed by local authorities. She represented exactly the kind of observational skill that could be cultivated and utilized. 2 months after the trial, Margaret received a visit from a woman named Elizabeth Thornton, who identified herself as working for a government agency that could not be named. Thornton was elegant, educated, and utterly direct in her proposal. "We need people like you," she told Margaret over tea in a Boston hotel. "People who see what others overlook, people who trust their observations and have the courage to act on them. The work would be classified. You would be trained in various skills, including observation techniques, communications, and analysis. When you complete your education, you would serve your country in ways that we cannot publicly acknowledge, but that are absolutely essential to winning this conflict." Margaret looked at this sophisticated woman and thought about her sketches, her quiet life at boarding school, her dreams of becoming a professional artist. Then she thought about the lighthouse, the hidden radio, the men plotting to help enemy submarines hunt American ships. She thought about the soldiers and sailors facing danger in the Atlantic, while spies transmitted their locations to lurking threats. "When do I start?" Margaret asked. Her training began the following summer. She learned codes and ciphers, radio operation, photographic analysis, and dozens of other skills that transformed her from an observant teenager into a capable intelligence operative. Her artistic talent proved invaluable, allowing her to create detailed sketches of people, places, and equipment from memory. Her youth and unassuming appearance became assets, allowing her to move through environments where more obvious agents would attract attention. Over the next 3 years, Margaret Sullivan worked on cases that she could never discuss publicly. She identified security breaches at defense plants. She helped expose a document theft ring operating out of a Navy yard. She served as a courier for sensitive materials and once spent 6 weeks posing as a factory worker to investigate suspected sabotage. The shy girl who had loved drawing lighthouses became someone else entirely, though she never forgot the moment that changed her life. The irony was not lost on her. Hendricks had been so confident in his isolation, so certain that a remote lighthouse was the perfect cover for his activities. He had prepared for detection by authorities, by Coast Guard inspectors, by counterintelligence professionals. What he had never anticipated was a 17-year-old art student with a good eye and the courage to trust what she saw. When the conflict ended in 1945, Margaret was 20 years old and held a position of significant responsibility within military intelligence. She had clearances that would remain classified for decades. She had seen and done things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, but she had also contributed to victories that saved countless lives, starting with that September afternoon when she glimpsed a radio through a cottage window. In the years after the conflict, Margaret did become the artist she had dreamed of being. She studied at prestigious institutions, held exhibitions in New York and Boston, and gained recognition for her architectural watercolors. She married a fellow intelligence officer who understood why certain questions could never be asked, and they built a quiet life in Connecticut. But she never painted lighthouses. That subject remained too loaded with memories of the day her innocence ended and her real life began. Decades later, when wartime secrecy statutes finally expired, portions of Margaret's story became public. Historians researching wartime espionage encountered her name in declassified files and sought her out for interviews. By then, she was in her 70s, her artistic career behind her, comfortable enough with the past to speak about it. "I was just trying to do a school assignment," she told one interviewer. "I saw something that seemed wrong, and I reported it. That so many consequences followed from such a simple action still astonishes me. But was it really simple? Consider what had to align for the Hendricks network to be exposed. Margaret had to choose that particular lighthouse from dozens along the Maine coast. She had to arrive on a day when Hendricks was distracted enough to leave equipment visible through a window. She had to position herself at exactly the angle where sunlight would illuminate that window's interior. She had to have enough technical knowledge to recognize military equipment. She had to be stubborn enough to persist, despite being dismissed by local authorities. She had to have a father with the right connections to reach people who would take her seriously. Change any one of those factors, and Hendricks might have continued transmitting for months or years more. Enemy submarines might have received intelligence that led to additional convoy attacks. Ships might have been torpedoed, sailors lost, crucial supplies sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The mathematics of consequence are impossible to calculate precisely, but intelligence analysts who studied the case estimated that shutting down the Hendricks network shortened submarine operations in that sector by several months and likely saved dozens of ships. One 17-year-old girl with a sketchbook and a good eye. Against her stood a sophisticated espionage network backed by foreign military intelligence, operating with years of preparation and extensive resources. It should not have been a fair fight, and it was not, though not in the direction Hendricks expected. The final twist in the story emerged years after the conflict, when additional records were declassified. Hendricks had been considered one of their most valuable American assets, praised by his handlers for his operational security and the quality of his intelligence. In the months before his exposure, he had transmitted information that contributed to several successful submarine attacks. Enemy military planners had come to depend on his reports and had organized their Atlantic strategy partially around the intelligence he provided. When he suddenly went silent, enemy intelligence assumed he had been compromised by sophisticated American counterintelligence operations. They conducted extensive reviews of their security procedures, looking for the leak that had betrayed such a valuable asset. They never imagined that their careful planning had been undone by a teenager who liked to draw buildings and happened to notice something through a window. Thomas Hendricks served 18 years in federal prison before dying of a heart attack in 1960. He never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he had been serving his homeland as any patriot would. His associates received various sentences, and the network they had built was completely dismantled. The full extent of the intelligence they had transmitted remained classified for decades, but damage assessments suggested it had been substantial. Margaret Sullivan died in 2009, at the age of 84. Her obituary mentioned her artistic achievements and her wartime service in vague terms, giving no hint of the story behind her recruitment. Among her personal effects, her family found a leather portfolio containing her original sketches from that September day at Pembroke Point Lighthouse. The drawings were precise and beautiful, capturing the stark beauty of the structure and its dramatic coastal setting. On the back of one sketch, in faded pencil, she had written a single sentence: "The day everything changed." The broader implications of Margaret's discovery extended far beyond the Hendricks network itself. Her case became a teaching example within intelligence circles, demonstrating how effective observation could come from unexpected sources. It influenced recruitment strategies and training programs, encouraging agencies to look beyond traditional candidates and recognize that valuable intelligence skills could emerge from diverse backgrounds and experiences. The lighthouse at Pembroke Point continued operating for another 40 years before automation made the keeper's position obsolete. The cottage where Hendricks had concealed his radio equipment was eventually torn down, replaced by a modern facility housing automated systems. Today, few visitors to the lighthouse know its wartime history or the role it played in one of the conflict's lesser-known espionage cases. For Margaret herself, the experience shaped not just her career, but her entire worldview. She had learned at 17 that ordinary people in ordinary circumstances could make extraordinary differences. She had discovered that paying attention mattered, that trusting one's observations was not paranoia but wisdom, and that courage sometimes meant simply reporting what you had seen, even when others dismissed your concerns. In her later years, Margaret occasionally spoke to art students about the importance of observation. She never revealed the full story of the lighthouse, bound by secrecy agreements that lasted decades, but she emphasized the value of truly seeing what was before you rather than what you expected to see. Art and intelligence work, she would say, both required the same fundamental skill, the ability to notice what others overlooked. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.